Okay, so welcome again to tonight's webinar as part of the Food Safety Foundation's series. As always, I just have a few housekeeping tasks to remind everyone. Um, First, if you um, can keep your microphone on mute until the Q&A portion of the webinar. Again, I'll try to be monitoring the chat, but I might not be able to look at that till the end. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them in the chat. To find the chat feature in your Zoom window, look for the speaking bubble icon or the chat button. The chat defaults to all webinar participants or everyone in the to field. To send a direct message to one individual, click the down arrow after everyone and select a specific participant. Next, if you need or want captions, you can enable these by finding the CC or Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not see the CC button, look for the More button with the 3 dots, and then you can click on that button to enable captions by toggling it on or off. So again, welcome to tonight's webinar, Canning Acidic and Acidified Foods. This is the third food preservation topic in the Food Safety Foundation series. During the January, February, and March webinars, we set the stage for safe food preservation by discussing pathogens that can contaminate food and cause foodborne illness, what pathogens need to grow, and how your actions can impact this growth, and then best practices for a thorough sanitation routine. Then in April, we reviewed a variety of equipment for different food preservation methods with an emphasis on how these contribute to the safety of your value-added and preserved foods. Then in May, we discussed making preserved fruit spreads like jams and jellies. In June, we covered pickling produce. And then today we are going to talk about acidified foods. So if you were unable to join us for one of those previous webinars, they are recorded, and I'm going to share the link in the chat to our YouTube playlist. So my name is Amy Johnston, and I am tonight's speaker. I'm a regional extension educator with the University of Minnesota on our food systems team, working in the area of food safety. Again, I don't have my usual technical support with me tonight, so bear with me as I try to share some links in the chat throughout the webinar. And again, I'll get to questions in the chat at the end. So let's dive in. So we do have a full agenda today. We're going to start with reviewing some key definitions on the types of acidic and acidified food products. Next, we'll dig into boiling water bath and atmospheric steam canning, specifically focusing on the importance of the heat treatment. And then we'll discuss how to test pH and recipe development. And then we'll touch on some different ways for selling your acidic and acidified foods here in Minnesota. And then, as always, leave you with some resources. So whether you're joining us to benefit your food business or you just want to learn more, I hope you leave this webinar with an increased confidence in your ability to prevent foodborne illness. At the end of the webinar, you will be able to identify safe acidic and acidified canned foods, know how to acidify low acid foods, know how to use a boiling water bath and an atmospheric steam canner, know how to measure the pH of your foods, and then be aware of the requirements for selling acidic and acidified canned foods. So for those of you who have been regularly joining this webinar series, some of these definitions might be familiar to you, but I still want to go over them because it's really important to understand these terms when making safe foods. So first is pH. pH is the measurement of acidity in a food. The pH scale is from 0 to 14, with 0 being the most acidic, 7 being neutral, so think of distilled water, and then 14 is the least acidic, also sometimes referred to as basic or alkaline. The pH of a food has an impact on bacteria survival and growth. Equilibrium pH, that is the final pH of both the solid food and the liquid in a container. When measuring equilibrium pH, you wait 24 hours after canning that product. Acidic foods are foods with a natural pH of 4.6 or less. And we'll talk more about these, but many fruits are acidic foods. They're naturally having a pH of 4.6 or less. And that pH of 4.6 or less, if you think back to the February webinar, that 4.6 is that benchmark that we are trying to hit to make shelf-stable foods safe. Acidified foods, these are low acid foods to which an acidifying component or an acidic food has been added. And then we have a finished equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below. Fermented foods are not considered acidified foods because their pH reduction is not achieved by adding an acidifying component or an acid. So we're not going to talk about fermented foods tonight. Acidifying components, these are ingredients with a low pH, so that 4.6 or less, that are added foods to lower the pH. And we'll talk more about those with some specific examples. And then thermal processing. That's the heat treatment that is used to inactivate pathogens and create that vacuum seal on your jar or container. When we talk about canning, there's two different thermal processing. There's a high heat and then the mild. Boiling water bath and atmospheric steam canning are considered a mild heat treatment. That's because this canning process is used with the boiling water temperature, so 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure canning is a more intense heat treatment because the pressure inside the canner raises the temperature of the liquid to between 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. So a much more intense heat treatment. And we're going to talk about pressure canning later this fall. So the type of thermal processing used is influenced by the pH of a food. Acidic and acidified foods can be canned using that boiling water bath or the atmospheric steam canner because they have that low pH, that pH of 4.6 or below. So when correctly prepared, acidic and acidified foods are non-potentially hazardous. So that means they don't have a very high food safety risk. So correct preparation includes that pH of 4.6 or less and the proper heat treatment. So we went into these pathogens in great detail in January, so I'll only touch on them now. But Listeria monocytogenes and some strains of E. coli and Salmonella are resistant to an acidic environment, so that low pH, and can survive in food for a period of time if they're not thermally treated. So that's why that heat treatment step in canning is really important. Acidification of food to that 4.6 or below prevents Clostridium botulinum spores from being able to germinate to the vegetative cells that then produce the toxin that can cause botulism. Yeasts and molds, especially molds that produce mycotoxins, which then cause illness, can't be in a product if they were not correctly prepared, or maybe the jar didn't seal properly. So then any molds or yeast just naturally in the air got into the food. So if contaminated, molds may be visible on top of the food in the jar, or if there's moving bubbles throughout the jar, that's evidence of cellular respiration. So don't sell or consume those products, and don't just simply scrape off mold. Just discard of those foods appropriately. So controlling as many food safety factors as you can when preparing foods is an important part of food safety. So for acidic and acidified foods, we're controlling the pH, and then we're also controlling temperature with that heat processing. There are three common acidifying components used in making acidified foods. And those are vinegar with a 5% acidity or 5% acetic acid, lemon juice, and citric acid. So vinegar has, with that 5% acidity, has a pH between 2.0 and 3.4, so very acidic. But lemon juice, especially the bottled lemon juice, has a pH of 2.0 to 2.6, so even more acidic. So really good at acidifying low acid foods. And then citric acid, when made into a solution following the manufacturer's instructions, will have a pH of about 3.2. So again, all of those are well below that 4.6 benchmark. When using vinegar, the most common ones used are distilled white vinegar and cider vinegar with that 5% acidity. And again, that acid and the vinegar is acetic acid. And research has shown that using the 5% acidity vinegar for pickling or acidifying foods is going to produce that safe and quality product. So on the image on the screen, you'll see the white arrow pointing to the vinegar label of where you might see that acidity level. In the past, a range of 4 to 6% acidity was recommended for use. However, that's no longer the case because there is a risk of using a vinegar with a 4% or less acidity, that the final product equilibrium pH might not get to that 4.6 or below. So use that 5%. And then do not use homemade vinegars unless the percent acidity has been measured. Again, because you want to make sure you're able to drop that pH. And then avoid using like balsamic or red wine vinegar, even if they have that 5% acidity, because their color can change the color of the produce that you're canning. And then bottled lemon juice is going to have a more consistent pH than fresh lemon juice. However, if you want to use fresh lemon juice, a good practice would be to measure its pH before using it to acidify your product. So these are the acidic and acidified foods that we're going to touch on today with just a couple caveats. So I included preserved fruit spreads, like our jams, jellies, marmalades, conserves, preserves, because they do have that pH of below 4.6. However, if you're looking to sell your foods, these preserved fruit spreads aren't going to fall under the same regulations for licensed food products of acidified foods. So I'm just mentioning it again because they do have that low pH and they are canned using a boiling water bath or an atmospheric steam canner. Pickled produce, such as the quick process or fresh pack pickles, for all types of produce, not just cucumbers, which is in the image. But then we have our canned fruits. So like I said earlier, many fruits are naturally acidic, and if not, many can be acidified. Again, for licensed food production, certain fruits are going to be excluded from some of the regulations just because they're naturally acidic. Acidified tomato products, like tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, and others. We're going to talk more about why tomato products need to be acidified before canning later today. And then acidified sauces and condiments. So think of like hot sauces, mustards, barbecue sauce, ketchups. All of those are acidified foods that are then canned. Some of these acidified sauces and condiments are going to have a really, really low pH that's low enough that a thermal processing step is not required. We're not going to dive into that tonight, just because of the sake of time. So if you are interested in learning more, please reach out and I'm happy to share information with you later. Because we had a whole webinar just designated to our preserved fruit spreads, I'm just going to hit the few key highlights. So our preserved fruit spreads, those are our jams, jellies, preserves, conserves, and marmalades. The key components in these foods are the fruit, pectin, acid, and sugar, and all of those play a role in the safety of the product. And for our food safety controls, we're looking for that water activity of 0.8 to 0.84. Their pH can be anywhere from 3 to 4.5. So again, they are acidic. And generally, these foods have a 1/4-inch head space because not too much room is needed inside the jar between the food and the lid to have that good vacuum created. And then they are heat treated using that boiling water or the atmospheric steam canner. Our pickled and acidified produce, again, I'm just going to hit a few key points because we did have the whole webinar on these. So this includes our pickled vegetables, pickled fruits, relishes, and chutneys. The key components in these foods are the produce, acid, salt, and water. And again, those have a role in both the safety and the quality of those foods. The food safety controls for these foods are having that pH of a 4.6 or less. They are that acidic food. There's some differences between hot pack and raw pack with our pickled produce, depending on the type of produce, the size of the pieces, and how the produce would respond to heating before or after. Heating, so using a hot pack method can improve the acidification process. So it's used in a lot of low acid vegetables that are getting pickled. The headspace will vary dependent on the food because of how much room is needed to allow that pickling liquid to boil without impacting the seal on on the jar. And then again, that heat treatment from a boiling water bath or an atmospheric steam canner in some cases. So as I mentioned, most fruits are naturally acidic or have a pH of 4.6 or less. So this means an acidifying component does not need to be added before canning in order to use that boiling water bath or the atmospheric steam canner. Again, because many their pH is already below that 4.6. But it's really important to do your research and understand the fruit that you are looking to can, because specific varieties of fruits can have varying pHs depending on the type. So some examples are white flesh peaches, which you can see on the screen. Those have a pH above 4.6, but yellow flesh peaches have a pH below 4.6. So yellow flesh peaches and yellow flesh nectarines, they are naturally acidic, but the white flesh varieties are not. Similarly, Asian pears, the image in the middle, they can be on the edge. They can have a pH of anywhere between 4.5 and 4.8, while your Bartlett pear is going to have a pH below 4.6. And then apricots are another example. Some varieties can have a pH as high as 4.8. Then the last image on the screen you see are elderberries. So elderberries are not naturally acidic. They have a pH of around 4.9, which is so they just can't be substituted in a recipe for a different berry, like blueberries that are naturally acidic. So again, understand the fruit that you are looking to can. To know if it's naturally acidic or if it needs to be acidified. So here I will share just a list of common foods, pH of common foods by Clemson University. Doesn't include all foods, but it's a good starting point. So before canning of fruits, it is important to inactivate the ripening enzymes that can cause darkening or color changes. So not a safety issue, but a quality issue. So to prepare the fruit, you'll want to make an acidic solution and dip the fruit into that solution. So this table on the screen shows you the proportions of some common dips that you can use for fruit. So lemon juice, citric acid, or ascorbic acid. And if you're using lemon juice, again, if you're using bottled lemon juice, you can have that confidence in the pH, and you can use three-quarters cup to 1 gallon of water. If you're using fresh lemon juice, test that pH and just make sure it is in that range. And then the citric acid and ascorbic acid, teaspoon each per 1 gallon of water. So it's really important to understand that this dipping of the fruit is not the same as acidifying or like pickling a fruit. This dipping the fruit in this acidic water mixture, it's done for a very short period of time. And again, it's just to inactivate those ripening enzymes. It's not going to be enough to change the pH. So don't confuse dipping the fruit with pickling fruit. Blanching firm fruits can also be an option. So certain apples, maybe some firmer pears, things like that. And then packing the fruits for canning. So fruits can be packed in hot water, juice or syrup, and packing the fruit in juice or syrup can help retain its flavor, color, and texture a little bit better than packing in hot water. Again, this is a quality control. It is not a food safety control. So if you use hot water, juice, or a syrup, that's not going to change the processing time of your canned fruit. So syrups, the table that you can see on the screen has 5 different syrup types listed from very light to very heavy with the approximate percent sugar and then the sugar to water ratio. So a very light syrup is only going to have about 10% sugar, and you would make it by dissolving 1 cup of sugar into 8 2/3 cup of water. And then you can see the very heavy syrup is 50% sugar. So it's an equal ratio of 1 cup to sugar to 1 cup of water. And you can scale the quantities to make enough syrup to cover the fruit in your jars. Um, Most commonly, light brown sugar, honey, most commonly just your granulated sugar is used, but you can use light brown sugar, honey, or corn syrup to replace up to half of the granulated sugar. So in the example of all of these, if you were using 1 cup of sugar, you could do a half cup of honey and a half cup of granulated sugar. Molasses or other strong dark color sweeteners can darken the fruits and overpower the flavor. You can also use sugar substitutes. Just make sure that they're heat stable and follow the labels for equivalents to make a syrup. And then common juices used are unsweetened apple juice, pineapple juice, or white grape juice, because they're not going to change the color of the canned fruit. And the strength of the juice can be adjusted just by adding hot water. Again, because this is not for a food safety control, it's for quality, you can adjust the amount of sugar or the strength of the juice to your taste. You could also extract juice from extra fruit and use that as the juice for your liquid. So canning the fruit, the thermal processing or that heat treatment time, it's going to be impacted by the size of the fruit. So if it's like a whole fruit, like the cherries you see on the screen, or if it's small pieces. If there's a peel or skin present versus no peel or skin present, again, that if there's a peel or skin, the heat has to first pass through that to get to the inside of the fruit. And then there's raw and hot pack styles. Again, going to be dependent on the type of the fruit and how easily the heat can penetrate that food. So I have a canning reference chart that I will share with you now. So on that web page, there's a variety of different charts. There's one for fruit, there's one for vegetables, and then there's one for tomatoes on there. And it lists different size jars, as well as then the processing time and the hot and raw pack styles. Okay, so acidified tomato products. The natural pH of tomatoes can vary from variety to variety, but also within the same type of variety, depending on many factors like the climate it was grown in, the soil type, and when it was harvested. And many varieties are right at that borderline. They might be at a 4.5, 4.6, 4.7, and then some are going to be higher. So to ensure the safety of tomato products, it is important to acidify any tomato product before canning. And that goes for if you're using the boiling water, the steam, or pressure canning. No matter the type of canning, acidify your tomato products. So on the screen, you can see different options for acidifying, and you'll add your acidifying component directly to the empty jar, each empty jar, and then add your tomato product. So if you're using pint jars, you would do 2 tablespoons of 5% vinegar or 1 tablespoon of the lemon juice. Again, using that bottled lemon juice, you know the pH is going to be consistent. If you're using fresh, test that pH, or a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. And then if you're using quarts, those amounts are doubled. You can add sugar to balance the flavor, the acidic flavor that these components might add, if needed, if you desire. So on the screen now you can see a table with the packed style, the headspace, the jar size, and the processing time for Minnesota. That Minnesota would fall into that 1,000, excuse me, that 1,001 to 3,000 feet. So you can see some differences in the times depending on the raw and the pack, or the raw or the hot pack, and I'll call out a couple. So you can see towards the bottom, there's options for tomatoes with no liquid, tomatoes in water, and then tomatoes in juice. So the tomatoes with no liquid, those are raw packed. So it's just your whole tomatoes going into that jar. They need 90 minutes versus tomatoes that are packed in water or juice, which need anywhere between 40 to 50 minutes, depending on what liquid and the size of the jar. And the reason of that is the tomatoes with no liquid, it's going to take longer for the internal temperature of the food in that jar to get hot enough, and then for that vacuum to seal. The liquid in the jars is really helpful at circulating heat and getting the food hot enough and creating that vacuum. I gave salsa its own slide to emphasize a couple points. So salsa is an acidified tomato product, but you cannot simply take a fresh salsa. So something that would be, just stored in the refrigerator and then can it, because the pH might not be low enough. If we're making a fresh salsa, we might squeeze, some lemon or lime juice, but we're not really acidifying that food. So we can't just can it. We need to use salsa recipes that have enough of that acid to bring the pH down to that 4.6 or less. So when making a salsa, try to use firmer varieties of tomatoes just because they're going to hold up a little bit better. Follow the recipe quantities for all the other ingredients, your onions and your peppers, and don't alter those amounts, because onions and peppers are low acid. So if you were to increase, say, oh, I like my salsa to have more peppers in it. If you were to increase the peppers, but not increase the amount of vinegar or the acidic component, you might not get that pH low enough. You can switch the types of peppers that you're using. So if you want a spicier salsa, you could use a hotter variety. If you like a milder one, you could use a more mild variety. The choice salsa recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation is really an excellent place to start for developing your own salsa recipe because it provides the ingredient ratios, how to prepare the ingredients, so like what size cut, and then the processing time. So I will share that link with you now. Salsas are also just a couple more notes. Are generally hot packed because that's going to help with that acidification of all of the ingredients. So at the beginning of the webinar, I mentioned a variety of different acidified sauces and condiments are things like our hot sauces, ketchup, mustards, barbecue sauces. Those might be what we traditionally think of, but there's also some really good recipes out there for other types of condiments. So I'm sharing one example from Ball Foods, their tomato red pepper kasundi. And that is a traditional Indian sauce that can get used in curries, marinating chicken, or just as a condiment on the side. And I picked this as an example because of the vinegars that are used in it. So if you think back to when we were talking about the acidifying components, I mentioned the distilled white vinegar and the apple cider vinegar. Those are the two most common vinegars used in acidified foods. If you're going to use a different vinegar, again, it needs to have that 5% acidity, and then make sure you're following a tested recipe. So this one uses malt vinegar, which gives it an additional flavor. And we can trust this because it is from a reputable source. It is from Ball. So we know that it has been tested and that final pH is going to be where we need it to be at that 4.6 or below. And I can share the recipe if you are curious. Okay, so now let's move into our types of canners. So boiling water bath canner is probably the one that most people are familiar with, and you can use a specific canner pot, or you can use just a large enough stock pot that meets all of these requirements that we're going to go through. So whether it's the canner or the very large stock pot, first thing is it needs to have a rack that the jars will sit in. And the rack is really important because it's going to allow water to circulate within the pot. So all sides of the jars are heated evenly so that heat can penetrate into the jar and reach that temperature that we need. Also, the rack should be big enough that your jars aren't too crowded. Again, we need to have space between each jar so that water can circulate. And again, we can have that even heat. The pot or the canner needs to be deep enough that there's enough water covering the tops of the jars. So you'll need 1 to 2 inches of water to cover the top of the jar. And again, we need that equal heat circulation of that water to get that good vacuum and to heat the foods properly. It should have a tight fitting cover. And you should have enough space above the water to allow for the water to boil without boiling over the pot and impacting your flame or your burner. And that cover needs to be tightly fitting to help keep all that heat in during the processing time. So when using a boiling water canner, that processing time starts when the water is boiling. And then the processing time is going to vary from product to product, depending on the type of the food, the size of the food pieces, if there's the peel or the skin, the amount of liquid in the jar. So think back to the tomato example, that the whole tomatoes with no liquid versus tomatoes with liquid. The temperature of the food at the start of processing, so hot pack versus raw pack, the size of the jar, and the amount of time needed to promote the acidification of that food. So a good recipe is going to have all of that addressed in it, so you can have confidence in that processing time. For those of you planning to sell your products at a larger scale, there are some different equipment, but the same principles apply. So these include like a commercial water bath or a steam jacketed canner. Or if you're working with a co-packer, they might have some automatic filling machines and can sealing machines. Atmospheric steam canners are usually just called steam canners, are appropriate for processing acidic or acidified foods that require less than 45 minutes of processing time. So if you look back at those charts, you'll see there's many foods that can be canned using a steam canner, but then there's also some that you should not use. And the reason being is in a steam canner, if you look at the picture with the canned fruit in it, the water is in the bottom of the canner. So there's only about 2 quarts of water versus the 16 quarts that are usually in a boiling water bath canner. So because we have less water, we're going to be limited on time. In the steam canner, the water again is placed in the bottom. You can see a rack, and that water line should be just below the rack. We don't want it above the rack. And again, we aren't overcrowding the jars because we need that steam to be able to circulate freely and heat all sides of the jars and the food evenly. The processing time of the food doesn't change if you're using a boiling water or the steam canner. In a steam canner, the processing time starts once there is a steady a steady stream of steam flowing from the hole that you can see on the sides of the canner. It'll be coming out, and it should be just a few inches long. And um, and it's because there's those specific vent holes that you can't just use like a stock pot and steam can, because there's not going to be a way for the steam to vent. So if you're going to use steam canning, you do need to use a designated steam canner. Oops. And I forgot to share another link with you when we were talking about condiments. I'm sharing a link with you right now for some good ideas for some homemade, home canned condiments. I know like there's a Dijon mustard in there. And then I'm also sharing a article about using a steam canner because it's not a very widespread known piece of equipment. So the majority of Minnesota is at an elevation of 1,200 feet. Um, You need to know that to know your processing time. Our highest point is 2,300 feet up at Eagle Mountain, and our lowest point near Lake Superior. There's also some higher elevations in southwest Minnesota, such as in Lincoln, Pipestone, Rock, Murray, Nobles, Jackson, and Cottonwood counties. So a safe recipe is going to include the processing instructions in the format similar that you can see on the screen, where it'll list the time based on either the raw or the hot pack, the size of the jar, and then your elevation. So again, knowing the elevation is important to picking the correct processing time. And we talked a little bit about this when we were discussing the acidified tomato products, but this is a good illustration of why processing times can differ so much from food to food. So when food is packed into a jar for canning and processing, we need to assume that, if there is a pathogen present, it's going to be evenly distributed throughout the entire jar. It's not just going to be at the top. So all the contents in the jar need to be heated to the same temperature at a minimum period of time. And so a safe recipe, a tested recipe, is going to have all of that figured out for you. And that's the processing time. So the image on the screen has 3 different jars, and you'll see a blue dot in each jar. And the blue dot represents the point in the jar that's the slowest to heat. The heat's going to take the longest to get to that spot. So the solid product, so again, those whole tomatoes that were not packed within any liquid, the coldest part or the slowest part to heat is going to be the center of that jar, again, because there's not that liquid helping to circulate the heat. That liquid product, the image in the middle, you can see the arrows which represent currents of the liquid. So its spot that's going to be the slowest to heat is towards the bottom of the jar, right where those currents are intersecting. And then a solid and liquid product, so a lot of our pickled foods, our canned fruits, those are going to be that mix of a solid and liquid. And you can see the slowest point to heat is towards the bottom third of the jar. And again, it's because there's that solid product, and there is going to be some heat currents in that liquid, but they're going to be interrupted by the solid foods. So again, a good recipe, a safe recipe, is going to have a processing time that has taken this all into consideration and testing. And so once you have processed your cans or your jars, you'll want to check to make sure that you hear that vacuum forming, and then you'll want to check all the jars once they've cooled to make sure they have sealed properly. And if they haven't, you'll need to reprocess or put in the refrigerator for use. So I'm going to play a quick video. And hopefully you can hear the sounds.
Two.
So those popping were the jars sealing, and now she's demonstrating an improperly sealed jar. So a vacuum did not form on this jar of jam. You can see the lid moves up and down, so it did not process. So you would need to either reprocess it or again, put it in the refrigerator until you're ready to use it. Okay, so I've mentioned safe recipes a few times now. So what does that actually mean? So safe are recipes are research-based recipes. Um, so on the screen, you can see some trusted sources for these safe recipes. There's the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, extension institutions or education institutions. So many of the resources I've shared with you so far tonight, those are from different education institutions. And then Ball publications from 1994 or newer. So when you're searching for those education institution recipes, you're probably going to do it on the internet. So to refine your search results to only be showing from education institutions, in your search engine, you'll type in your keyword or your phrase followed by site:/edu. So example, canning tomatoes at home, site:/edu. And that's going to limit your search results to only pages that have been published by a university. And so while there are a lot of research-based tested recipes, what if you have that family recipe that's been passed down from generation to generation, or you want to create your own? The simplest way to start is by following safe substitution guidelines and studying those research-based tested recipes. So I will share here in the chat a link to safe substitutions, kind of cheat sheet, I'll call it. And then, however, if you want to get really creative and develop your own recipe, using the principles we discussed today and in the past webinars, and then having that recipe and the product tested in a food lab. That food lab is going to review the recipe, it's going to test the product, and it's going to make sure that your processing time is correct to inactivate any of those pathogens. So if you make some home canned foods, but you are questioning how they came out, the National Center for Home Food Preservation did publish a pretty useful guide of causes and possible solutions for problems with home canned foods. So it will say, what if the color is off? Is that a concern or not? So things like that guide will help with. There's also the experts at the Answer Line. The Answer Line is a joint collaboration with Iowa State University Extension and University of Minnesota Extension. So if you are developing your own recipe, just a few key points I want to emphasize. So study those research-based recipes that are similar to what you're wanting to make. This is going to help you find a starting point for the ratio of components. When writing your recipes, use weights instead of volume as much as possible, as that's going to help with consistency between batches and then will allow you to scale that recipe. Consider both hot and raw pack methods from the standpoint of acidification and the final texture. Again, hot pack methods are going to help with that acidification process. You're going to want to test the equilibrium pH of your final food. And we'll talk more about this on the next slide. And then again, that processing time is required by how long it takes for food in the slowest to heat part of the jar to reach the temperature that's needed to inactivate pathogens and create that vacuum. And like we saw on the previous slide, that spot is going to vary in the jar depending on the type of product. So again, that food lab we'll be able to help test that and make sure that it is safe. So some information that you will likely need to know, again, if you are developing your own recipe and trying to work with a lab on determining that processing time for your acidic and acidified foods, the internal temperature of the food is going to need to reach a certain degrees. And that degrees is needed again to inactivate pathogens and then also make sure that that vacuum is properly sealing. So acidified foods that have a pH of 4.3 to 4.6, the internal temperature of all of the food and all of the liquid inside that jar needs to reach 210 degrees Fahrenheit for a specific period of time. And you can see the temperature goes down to 175 degrees if that acidic or acidified food has a pH of 3.5 or less. And that's because of the role pH plays in activating pathogens when heat is involved. So again, that time is going to depend on the type of food. A lab is going to help you conduct what's called a heat penetration test. So you're able to measure when that slowest point to heat in the jar reaches that required temperature based on that pH. So for measuring the pH of your final products, pH test strips are not a reliable testing method. You want to use a pH meter with a 2-point calibration. And what that means is there's two solutions, usually an acidic solution and a neutral solution, that are those reference points for the meter, so you know that it's reading correctly. And then again, you'll measure at 24 hours. The product should be at room temperature or an ambient temperature because of if it's still hot, you could get a false reading. And then you need to test the solid food and the liquid separately because they should be very similar. You don't want to have the liquid very acidic, but then your solid food not, because that could have a food safety risk. So I have a short video that I'm going to kind of skip through that'll show how to use a pH meter. And before I play it, you'll see she's got a salsa and then green beans. And you're going to see her puree up the green beans and add distilled water because we need the green beans in a liquidy or in a form that the pH meter is going to be able to read the pH. We can't read the pH of that solid green bean, but the salsa is liquidy enough that we'll be fine. So again, we're waiting at least 24 hours to test. Here you can see she is going to puree up the green beans, adding that distilled water. We're separating the liquid. And then she's getting that consistency that we can actually measure. And then for testing of the food product, you'll rinse your probe. This is after you've calibrated. You'll dip your probe into your food until you get the final message. Record that number, and you want to repeat at least 2 to 3 times, and then you'll take an average of that pH, and it should be at that 4.6 or below. Okay. Um, so now just hitting a couple key points if you're interested in selling your acidic or your acidified foods. So for cottage foods, this is without a license, and you can make this food in your home. So home processed and home canned foods in Minnesota. They need to be non-potentially hazardous, so that equilibrium pH of 4.6 or less, and they cannot require refrigeration for food safety. So if it's a pickled product, it needs to be that canned pickled product. It can't be, something that you pickled and then never canned, or it can't be a fresh salsa. It has to be a canned salsa. Again, you need to use research-based recipes or follow that process for developing your own recipe and having it tested in a lab. For licensed food processing and manufacturing, before you begin, you'll need to complete what is called a Better Process Control School, or an approved acidic food GMP, Good Manufacturing Process School. And in that, you'll learn everything that you need to know from sanitation, thermal processing, equipment, containers, enclosures, record keeping, and all the other resources to keep your acidified food business safe. Um, and then there's some other requirements. You'll complete what is called a scheduled process. Minnesota Department of Ag calls this a HACCP plan. It's very similar to having your recipe and your final product tested. You'll register and file with the Food and Drug Administration. You'll need to show that you have procedures in place for monitoring and testing, and what you'll do if there's a deviation. Have your record keeping plan and your recall procedure plans. So again, that is just very, very high level to kind of get you aware of what is involved if you are looking to sell. In the chat right now, I'm just putting some links for more information on licensed food sales. I know we're over on time. I thank you for sticking with me as I'm trying to juggle everything tonight. So before I open it up for any questions, just if you do have time, really appreciate it if you're able to complete the evaluation. It's very short. Your feedback is important, and it helps guides future programming. I just put the link in the chat, or you can follow the QR code. And then next month, we're going to be talking about making and selling juice. Again, scan the QR code, or you can follow the link. I will put that in the chat next. And with that, I'm not in a rush. So if anybody has any questions, I am more than happy to